There is an old Taoist teaching about water. When a pond is stirred, the mud rises and the water turns cloudy, and no matter how hard you stare into it, you cannot see the bottom. But if you simply stop stirring, the mud settles on its own, and the water becomes clear again, not because anyone forced it to, but because that is what water does when it is left alone. Tonight we explore that teaching and what it might mean for a mind that feels muddied by worry, by decisions, by thoughts that will not stop circling. If you know nothing about Taoism, you are in exactly the right place. You do not need any prior knowledge to be here tonight. You only need to know the feeling of trying so hard to think your way out of something that you only stir it up more. The exhaustion of a mind that will not stop working, even when working is not what it needs. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. Tonight we will move slowly through 13 short chapters, each one returning to this same quiet idea from a different angle. A pond, a wheel, a mirror, a sky full of stars. None of it needs to be remembered. None of it needs to be solved. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. There is a passage in the Tao Te Ching, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, that asks a quiet question. Who can wait patiently while the mud settles and remain still until the right action arises on its own? It is not a question about cleverness. It is a question about patience. The ancient sages were described as being like ice beginning to melt, unhurried, unforced, allowing change to happen at its own pace rather than pushing it forward. Most of us, when our minds feel muddy, do the opposite of waiting. We stir harder. We turn the problem over and over, hoping that one more pass will make it clear. But clarity does not arrive that way. It arrives the way mud settles in a pond, only once the stirring stops. This is not a passive idea. It asks something quietly demanding of us. To trust a process we cannot see happening, simply because we have seen it happen before. Tonight's invitation is simple: to stop stirring and let the water find its own way back to stillness. In a small village at the edge of a wide valley, there lived an old woman who was known simply as the keeper of the pond. She had tended the same pond for as long as anyone could remember, though no one quite knew what tending a pond involved, since she rarely seemed to do anything to it at all. She would sit by its edge in the mornings, watching the light move across the surface, and say nothing. The villagers had long ago stopped asking her what she was waiting for. Some assumed she was simply old and content to sit. Others suspected she was watching for something specific, some sign in the water that only she understood. In truth, she was not waiting for anything at all. She had simply learned many years before that sitting beside something without demanding anything of it tended to reveal more than any amount of careful searching ever could. One evening, a young man from the village came to her, his steps quick and uneven, the way a person walks when their mind has outpaced their feet. He found her sitting on the same flat stone she always sat on, watching the pond settle into the colors of dusk. "I need your help," he said. "I have to decide whether to leave the village or stay. I have turned it over every night for 2 months, and I am no closer to an answer. My mind will not rest." The old woman did not look up right away. She gestured for him to sit, and after a moment he did, though his knee bounced with impatience even as he lowered himself to the ground. "Look at the pond," she said. He looked. The water was murky, stirred by the wind and by a group of children who had been wading in it earlier that day. He could not see more than a hand's depth below the surface. "I cannot see anything," he said. "It's just dirt and water. What do you see when you think about leaving the village?" He frowned. "Confusion. The same arguments going around and around. For, against, for, against." "And when you think about staying?" "The same thing, just churning." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "Put your hand in the water," she said. "Stir it." He looked at her, confused, but did as she asked, swirling his hand through the murky pond. The water grew darker, the silt rising in thick clouds around his fingers. "Now," she said, "tell me what is at the bottom." "I can't see the bottom. I just made it worse." "Yes," she said, "that is what you have been doing with your mind for 2 months. Every night you reach in and stir, hoping that this time the stirring will show you the bottom. It never will. Stirring does not reveal. Stirring obscures." The young man sat with this, watching the cloud of disturbed silt slowly drift and spread across the surface of the pond. "So what do I do? Just not think about it?" "I did not say stop thinking," the old woman replied. "I said stop stirring. There is a difference. The water does not need you to think harder about being clear. It needs you to stop disturbing it long enough for the dirt to fall where it belongs. But how do I know when it is settled? What if I wait and nothing happens?" She allowed herself a small smile. "Have you ever known a pond that did not eventually settle, once left alone?" He considered this. "No, I suppose not." "Then trust that your mind is not so different from this water. It is not broken. It does not need to be fixed. It only needs to be left undisturbed long enough to do what water has always done." They sat together for a long while, the evening deepening around them, the children's voices fading as they were called home for supper. Slowly, without anyone touching it, the pond began to clear. The silt that the young man had stirred settled back to the bottom, grain by grain, and the surface grew calm enough to hold a faint reflection of the rising moon. "It's clearing," he said, almost in surprise, as though he had expected it to stay murky forever out of spite. "It always does," the old woman said. "The question was never whether it would clear. The question was whether you could stop stirring long enough to let it." He looked at the water for a long time, watching his own face emerge, faint and rippling on the surface. He did not ask her again whether he should stay or leave. He simply sat and watched, and let the evening settle around him the way the silt had settled in the pond. "I still don't know what I'm going to do," he admitted eventually. "I did not ask you to know," she said. "I asked you to stop stirring. The knowing, if it comes, will come on its own time. It usually does once the water is calm enough to hold it. Before she rose to go inside, she paused at the door and looked back at him. "May I tell you one more thing?" "Please," he said. "The children who stirred this pond earlier today were not wrong to do it. Children are supposed to stir things. That is how they play, how they learn the shape of the world around them. The mistake is not in stirring. The mistake is in refusing to let it settle afterward, in believing the cloudy moment is the permanent truth of the water rather than simply a passing condition. So my mind isn't broken, it's just been stirred. Your mind is exactly as capable of clarity as it has always been," she said. "Nothing in you needs repairing. You only need to stop mistaking the cloudy moment for the whole story." He thought about this long after she had gone inside, turning it over far more gently than he had turned over his decision these past 2 months. There was something almost funny in it, he thought, that he had spent so long treating his own confusion as a flaw to be corrected through more effort, when it had only ever been mud, doing exactly what mud does when it is disturbed. He stayed by the pond until well after dark, long after the old woman had gone inside, watching the moon's reflection grow steadier and clearer as the night wore on, needing nothing from him at all. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding of the relationship between stillness and clarity. The poet Rumi often wrote of the heart as a mirror, one that becomes clouded by the dust of constant striving and clears only when polished by stillness rather than force. He did not describe enlightenment as something seized through effort. He described it as something uncovered, the way a mirror's true reflective nature is revealed once the dust is no longer being added to it. There is a second strand in this tradition worth noting. Sufi teachers often spoke of the heart's eye, an inner seeing that has nothing to do with the busy thinking mind. This eye, they said, opens only in quiet. The constant noise of calculation, of anxious turning over, was seen as a veil rather than a tool. Clarity was not manufactured by the mind working harder. It was something the mind could only receive once it grew quiet enough to notice what had been present all along. Both traditions, separated by mountains and centuries, arrive at the same gentle conclusion. The answer is rarely missing. It is only obscured. And the obscuring is something we do to ourselves, usually with the best of intentions, usually believing that one more round of effort will finally produce the clarity we are after. You may know this feeling already. Lying in bed, turning over a decision you have already turned over 100 times, certain that just one more pass of thinking will finally produce the answer. Perhaps it is a conversation you need to have tomorrow, replayed and rehearsed until the words lose all meaning. Perhaps it is a choice between two paths, weighed and reweighed until the weighing itself becomes the only thing left in your mind. Tonight, you do not need to solve anything. You do not need to find the bottom of the pond before you are allowed to rest. You only need to stop stirring, to let your hand come up out of the water and rest at your side. Notice if you are reaching for an answer right now. If you are, you can let that reaching loosen just slightly. Not because the question does not matter, but because the answer is not found by gripping it tighter. It is found by leaving it alone long enough to settle. Perhaps it is something smaller than a decision too, an offhand comment from earlier today that you cannot stop replaying, turning it over for hidden meanings it likely never had. That, too, is a kind of stirring. It, too, can be left alone. Let your mind be like that pond tonight, murky for a moment perhaps, but already on its way to clearing, simply because nothing more is being added to disturb it. The clearing happens on its own. It always has. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching speaks of returning all things, after their busy growing and striving, eventually return to stillness. The way leaves fall back to the root of the tree that grew them. This returning is not a defeat. It is not the mind giving up. It is recognized as the most natural movement there is, the same way a held breath eventually wants to be released. We spend so much energy resisting this return, believing that constant motion is the same as progress. But the sage in this teaching watches all things cycle outward into activity and then circle back to rest, and finds in that rhythm something steady to trust. Stillness, then, is not a strange destination we must struggle to reach. It is where we are already heading, if only we stop fighting the current that is already carrying us there. Even the busiest day eventually folds itself into evening without anyone forcing the sun to set. Our minds are no different, however convinced we sometimes become that they are. There was once a potter who lived on the outskirts of a small settlement near a river, known across the region for vessels so symmetrical that people said her hands must have some secret the other potters lacked. A young apprentice came to her one autumn, eager and anxious in equal measure, having left his own village in hopes of learning her craft. Other villagers had warned him she rarely took students, and those she did take rarely lasted more than a season. He had assumed this meant her standards were impossibly high. It would take him most of the winter to understand that the difficulty was not in meeting her standards, but in unlearning the urgency he had carried with him his whole life. For the first weeks, he watched her work without being allowed to touch the clay. This frustrated him terribly, though he said nothing. Finally, she let him sit at the wheel. His first attempts collapsed almost immediately. The clay wobbled, tore, slumped sideways into shapeless lumps. He grew more frustrated with each failure, pressing harder, spinning the wheel faster, as though speed and force might compensate for what his hands did not yet know. "You are fighting the wheel," the potter said one afternoon, watching him struggle with a piece that had already collapsed twice. "I'm trying to control it," he said, breathless with effort. "If I don't push, nothing happens." She knelt beside him and placed her hand gently over his, slowing his motion. "Watch," she said, and pressed her foot lightly to slow the wheel's spin. "What happens when you stop pushing?" He reluctantly let his hands go still, hovering just above the surface of the clay as the wheel continued turning, slower now, more even. "It's not collapsing," he said, surprised. "No, because you stopped adding force to a shape that did not need more force. You only needed to let the wheel do what it already knew how to do, and let your hands simply receive what it offered." He tried again, this time letting his hands rest more lightly against the spinning clay, guiding rather than pushing. The vessel held its shape, wobbling only slightly, rising slowly into something that resembled, faintly, A bowl. Encouraged, he grew excited and pressed his thumbs in harder to speed the shaping. The bowl crumpled instantly, folding in on itself. He sat back, exasperated. "I don't understand. I did the same thing, just faster." "You did not do the same thing," the potter said. "You let go of stillness the moment you felt a little success. The wheel slows on its own, in its own time. You tried to hurry its slowing, and that is exactly the moment it fell apart. Then how do I know how much pressure to use, how fast to go? You make it sound like I should do nothing at all." The potter shook her head. "Not nothing, just not forcing. There is a difference between shaping clay and demanding that it becomes something before it is ready. Your hands are not the only thing making this bowl. The wheel is making it too, in its own time, with its own momentum. Your task is to notice that momentum and move with it, not against it." He frowned, clay drying in flecks on his fingers. "That sounds like I'm not really doing anything." "You are doing a great deal," she said. "You are paying attention. You are responding to what is already happening rather than insisting on what you wish were happening. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the hardest skill there is." For many weeks after that, he kept failing, kept collapsing his vessels in fits of impatience whenever the wheel did not move fast enough for his liking. But slowly, almost without noticing, he began to feel the difference between guiding and forcing. He began to wait, just slightly, before each motion, to let the wheel's natural slowing tell him when to lighten his hands rather than deciding in advance how fast things ought to go. One evening, long after the others had gone to eat, he sat at the wheel by lamplight and made a small bowl, unremarkable in every way, except that for the first time he had not fought it once from beginning to end. He simply let the clay rise as the wheel slowed, asking nothing of it that it was not already prepared to give. He brought it to the potter the next morning, unsure if it was good enough to show her at all. She turned it over in her hands for a long moment, running her thumb along its rim. "This is the first one you made without straining," she said. "I didn't even notice I'd stopped straining." "That is usually how it happens," she said, setting the bowl down gently between them. "You don't notice the moment the wheel stops being something you are fighting. You only notice afterward that somehow, without forcing it, something whole was made. Will it always feel this uncertain? Will I always have to wonder whether I've stopped straining or not?" "For a while, yes," she said. "But the wondering itself softens with practice, the same way the straining did. One day you will simply sit at the wheel and your hands will know, without you needing to ask them, when to press and when to rest." "That sounds like a long way off." "It is closer than you think," she said, picking the bowl back up and turning it once more in the morning light. "You made this one without straining. That means the knowing is already somewhere in your hands. It only needs more mornings like this one to trust itself fully." He looked at the small, unremarkable bowl sitting between them, hardly able to believe that something so plain could mark any kind of turning point. But he understood, faintly, what she meant. The bowl was not impressive. It was simply honest, made without a single moment of force from beginning to end, and that, she seemed to be telling him, was worth more than any amount of skillful straining. In Lakota and other Native American teachings, there is a similar understanding of stillness as a doorway rather than an emptiness. Many traditions speak of the importance of sitting quietly with the land, listening before acting, allowing a decision to arise from careful attention rather than hurried calculation. The vision quest, found across several plains nations, involved long periods of solitude and stillness, specifically because clarity was understood to come to those who waited rather than those who chased. There is a second point worth holding alongside this. In Lakota thought, the circle is a central image. The seasons, the movement of the sun, the cycles of life, all turning and returning, never resisting their own rhythm. Stillness was not separate from this cycle. It was the necessary rest between one turning and the next, as essential as the motion itself. Both the potter's wheel and the circle of the seasons describe the same quiet truth. Nothing is asked to move faster than its nature allows. The wheel slows because slowing is part of its turning, not a failure of it. And clarity, like the seasons, arrives in its own unhurried time, never on command, always eventually. Think of the times you have tried to force an insight that simply was not ready. Staring at a blank page, willing the right words to appear, only to feel them slip further away the harder you reached. Or think of a decision you have tried to rush, pushing yourself to choose before you had actually arrived at clarity. The way the apprentice pushed his thumbs into clay that was not yet ready to hold a shape. Tonight, as you lie here, you do not need to push anything into place. You do not need your thoughts to resolve themselves on a schedule. Let your mind be like that wheel slowing down at the end of the day. And let your hands, metaphorically, come to rest above it, rather than pressing down. If a worry surfaces, you do not need to shape it into an answer right now. You can simply let it spin a little slower, and a little slower again, the way a wheel naturally loses momentum once nothing more is pushing it forward. Feel that slowing in your own body now, your breath, like the wheel, finding its own natural, unhurried pace. There is no deadline on tonight's rest, and nothing waiting on the other side of sleep that requires a fully resolved answer before morning. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Da Da Jing about knowing that to know others is wisdom, but to know oneself is enlightenment. This kind of self-knowledge is not gathered like facts. It is uncovered, the way still water reveals a riverbed that was always there beneath the current. A mind in constant motion cannot see itself clearly, any more than a rushing river can show you what lies on its own floor. The strange thing is that we often believe more thinking will bring more self-understanding, when in truth, understanding tends to arrive in the gaps between thoughts, not in the thoughts themselves. The river does not become honest by moving faster. It becomes honest by slowing down enough to let its own bed show through. This is, perhaps, the gentlest definition of self-knowledge there is. Not an answer assembled through cleverness, but a quiet seeing that was always available beneath the surface noise. Near a wide, slow-moving river, there lived a man who fished there most mornings, though he was known less for his skill with fish than for his patience, which the other fishermen found almost unsettling. He could sit for hours without a single bite, perfectly still, seeming entirely unbothered. The other fishermen often joked that he caught more fish doing nothing than they caught working hard all morning, though none of them said it with any real malice. Mostly they were simply puzzled, the way anyone is puzzled by a kind of patience they have never managed to learn themselves. A younger fisherman, restless and frustrated after months of poor catches, came to sit beside him one grey morning, his tackle box banging loudly as he set it down. "I don't understand how you do it," the young man said. "I move from spot to spot, I change my bait, I try every trick I know, and still I catch nothing. You sit in one place and barely move, and somehow the fish come to you." The old fisherman smiled, but said nothing for a while, watching his line where it disappeared into the slow brown water. "Tell me," he finally said, "what does the river look like where you've been fishing?" "Fast, choppy. There's a current near the bend that churns up the bottom." "And here?" The young man looked at the water in front of them. It moved so slowly it seemed almost still, the surface holding a clear, steady reflection of the clouds overhead. "Calmer," he admitted. "Fish do not like to be where the water is constantly churning," the old man said. "They go where it rests. If you want to find them, you must first find the places where the river itself has gone quiet." The young man frowned, considering this. "But I'm not the river. I'm just trying to catch fish." "You are also not finding fish," the old man said gently. "Perhaps the lesson is not only about where the fish are, but about how you fish. You said you move constantly, change your bait, try every trick. Have you ever simply sat, the way I'm sitting, and waited? I get bored. I feel like I'm wasting time if I'm not doing something." "And how has doing something been working for you?" The young man laughed despite himself. "Badly, apparently." They sat together for a while, the older man's line motionless, the younger man's fidgeting hands eventually growing still as well, as though stillness was something that could be caught, almost like a fish, simply by sitting near someone who already had it. "I want to ask you something else," the young man said eventually. "It's not really about fishing." "I assumed as much," the old man said, not unkindly. "I don't know what I want. Not really. I keep trying to figure it out. What kind of life I should build, what I should care about. But every time I try to think it through, I just end up more confused than before. I thought maybe if I asked enough people, or read enough, or thought about it hard enough, it would become clear. And has it? No. If anything, it's gotten muddier. Like I've stirred it up so much I can't even remember what it looked like before I started asking." The old fisherman nodded slowly, as though this were a familiar story, one he had perhaps lived through himself many years before. "You have been doing with your own mind what you do with the river, moving constantly, hoping that motion will reveal something motion cannot reveal. But a riverbed is not seen by stirring the water faster. It is seen when the water finally stops moving long enough to let the light reach all the way down. So I should just stop thinking about it." "I did not say stop thinking. I said stop stirring. There's a difference, though I understand why it sounds the same at first. Thinking, when it is calm, can be like still water, clear enough to see through, but thinking driven by panic, by the fear of not knowing, becomes like a current churning the bottom. It does not show you anything. It only hides what was already visible. The young man sat with this for a long while, staring at the slow water in front of them, trying to imagine his own mind as a riverbed, wondering what might be down there if he simply let the current settle. What if I look and there's nothing there? What if I let it go still and I still don't know what I want? The old fisherman's line twitched very slightly, and he did not move to react to it, watching instead to see if the fish would commit. "I have never known a river to have no bed," he said. "Sometimes it is farther down than we expect. Sometimes it takes longer to see than we'd like. But it is always there, waiting to be seen, not made." "How will I recognize it when it finally surfaces? I've been confused for so long I'm not sure I'd trust it even if it appeared." The old man considered this for a moment, his eyes still on the water. "You will probably doubt it at first. That is common. The mind, after so much stirring, grows suspicious of stillness, the way a person who has lived near loud water for years might distrust the quiet of a calm night. But doubt it gently, if you must. Don't stir against it. Let the doubt itself settle too, the same way everything else settles, given enough patience." "That seems like an awful lot of settling." The old man allowed a small, dry laugh. "It is. Most worthwhile things require more settling than we'd like. But a river settles whether we are patient with it or not. The only real choice we have is whether we make peace with that pace or spend our days fighting against it." The fish did not bite that morning, not for either of them. But the young man stayed at the river's edge long after he usually would have given up and moved on to try a new spot, simply sitting, simply watching the water hold its slow and steady reflection of the sky. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding of clarity arising from stillness rather than constant mental effort. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote of retreating into oneself, noting that nowhere can a person find a more peaceful retreat than within their own mind, provided that mind has been put into proper order through quiet reflection rather than agitated striving. There is a second thread worth holding here. The Stoics distinguished sharply between what lies within our control and what does not, and much of their practice involved simply ceasing to struggle against what could not be changed by force of will. Seneca wrote often of the mind exhausting itself through unnecessary worry, comparing an anxious mind to a sea stirred by every passing wind, unable to reflect anything clearly until the wind itself died down. Both the river and the Stoic sea describe the same gentle truth. The mind, like water, has its own natural clarity. It is not something we must manufacture through effort. It is something we uncover, simply by no longer disturbing what was already capable of being clear. Perhaps you know this feeling, trying to understand your own feelings about something, turning the question over so many times that you no longer remember what you originally felt. Only the exhaustion of having searched so hard. Or perhaps it is a quieter version of this, lying awake, trying to decide what you actually want from a situation, certain that one more round of analysis will finally deliver the answer you have been chasing. Tonight, you do not need to find the bottom of that river by force. You do not need to know right now what you want, what you feel, or what you should do next. You can let the current of your thoughts slow, the way water slows where the riverbank widens, and trust that whatever is true for you is still there, waiting, even when you cannot yet see it clearly. Feel your own thoughts beginning to settle now, the way a river widens and softens before it reaches the sea. There is nothing you need to find tonight. There is only this slowing, this widening, this quiet permission to stop searching for a moment. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Jing speaks of a nameless source from which all things arise, something that existed before words, before shape, before any of our careful categories. It is described as silent and empty, yet endlessly giving rise to everything that is. We tend to think clarity must come dressed in language, a clean sentence, a tidy conclusion, something we could say out loud and feel certain about. But the deepest clarity often arrives wordless, more like a felt sense than a spoken answer. The nameless does not need naming to be real, and the understanding we are searching for at night, turning a problem over and over for words that will make it make sense, may already be present in us, quietly, long before we manage to say it. We do not have to wait for the sentence to arrive before we are allowed to feel settled. The feeling often comes first. A calligrapher lived in a small house near the edge of a market town, known for brushstrokes so fluid they seemed to have been drawn in a single unbroken breath. Merchants would pay handsomely for a single line of her writing to hang above their doorways, certain it brought good fortune. No one in the town had ever seen her hesitate over a single stroke. This was part of her reputation, though she herself rarely spoke of it, content instead to let the work speak for whatever quiet discipline had produced it. A student came to study under her, eager to learn the secret of her hand. For the first year, she had him only grind ink and prepare paper, never once letting him touch a brush. He bore this with growing frustration, certain that once he was finally allowed to write, his skill would surely surpass what so much waiting deserved. When at last she handed him a brush, his hand trembled so badly that the first character came out crooked, the ink blotting unevenly across the page. "I don't understand," he said, staring at the ruined character. "I have watched you for a year. I know exactly how the stroke should move." "Knowing and doing are different rivers," she said. "Try again." He gripped the brush tighter this time, determined to force his hand into stillness through sheer will. The result was worse, the line jagged, the ink pooling where his hand had hesitated. "The harder I try to hold it steady, the more it shakes," he said, exasperated. "Yes," she said simply, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "Then how do I stop it from shaking?" "You do not stop a trembling hand by commanding it to be still. You stop it by loosening your grip on the brush and on yourself." He tried this, though it felt counterintuitive, almost reckless, to hold the brush more loosely when what he wanted was more control. His next stroke wavered less, though it was still far from what he had hoped. Better, she said, watching over his shoulder. But you are still trying to write the character before your hand is ready to write it. I don't understand what that means. I'm writing the character. That's what I'm doing right now. You are forcing a shape onto the page that your hand has not yet learned to make on its own. Watch. She took a fresh sheet and made the same character, her hand moving without apparent effort, the brush seeming to glide rather than press. Did you see how I was not thinking about each stroke? How could you not be thinking about it? It's so precise. Because I am no longer trying to think my way into precision. The thinking happened years ago, slowly, every day, until it stopped needing to be thought at all. Now my hand simply knows, the way a bird does not think about each beat of its wings. The student set down his brush, discouraged. Then I am years away from writing anything worth looking at. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps you are only a few weeks away from understanding the one thing that matters, which has nothing to do with years. What is that? That your hand trembles because you want this too much, right now, in this moment. The wanting is not wrong, but it cannot be in the hand while the hand is writing. It must step aside and let the hand move on its own. Wanting and doing cannot share the same brush. He frowned at this, turning it over as he had turned over so many lessons before. So I should not want to write well? You may want it with your whole heart before you sit down, and you may want it again after you stand up. But while the brush is moving, there must be nothing in you but the brush, the ink, and the paper. No wanting, no judging, just the line allowed to happen. He practiced this for many more months, and his hand continued to tremble whenever he caught himself hooping too hard for a clean stroke. But slowly he began to notice the difference between the trying that helped and the trying that hindered, between preparation, which could be effortful, and the moment of the stroke itself, which needed to be free of effort entirely. One evening, working long after the lamps in the rest of the house had been put out, he made a single character that surprised him with its steadiness. He sat staring at it for a long while, unsure what had been different. When he showed it to his teacher the next day, she studied it for a long moment in silence. "This one you did not want," she said finally. "I did want it. I want it every time. You wanted it before you sat down. But in this stroke, I think, for once you simply let your hand move and stepped out of its way." He could not remember the exact moment this had happened. It had not felt like an achievement. It had felt, if anything, like nothing at all, like the absence of the trying that had been there before. "That is usually how it happens," she said, as though she had read the thought on his face. "The good stroke rarely announces itself. It simply appears once the trembling has nothing left to grip onto. Will every stroke feel this way now? Will the trembling stop for good?" "No," she said, almost gently. "The trembling will return, especially on days when you want something too badly again. That is simply the nature of wanting. But you have now felt the other way, the way without trembling. And a hand that has felt that once will always know how to find it again, even if it takes a little longer some days than others." "Then I haven't really learned anything permanent." "You have learned something better than permanent," she said. "You have learned a door, not a destination. A door can be walked through again and again for the rest of your life. Whenever you remember it is there. That is more useful than arriving somewhere once and being stuck there forever." He sat with the small character for a long while after she left him alone in the room, looking at it not as proof of anything mastered, but as evidence of a door he now knew how to find, even if his hand would tremble again tomorrow, even if it took him many more sheets of paper before he found that same stillness twice. In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding of effortless clarity, often described through the practice of dhyana, written here as jnana, meaning meditative absorption, in which the mind settles past its usual chatter into a state of quiet awareness. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of the wise as those whose minds remain steady and undisturbed, like a lamp in a windless place, its flame neither flickering nor straining, simply burning clearly because nothing is moving it. There is a second point worth holding here. In this tradition, the self is often described as already complete, already whole, obscured only by the restless movements of thought, much the way clouds obscure a sun that has never actually stopped shining. The work, then, is not to create light, but to let the clouds part on their own. Both the calligrapher's hand and the windless lamp describe a single understanding. What we are seeking is rarely absent. It is simply covered over by our own striving, and clarity, like a steady flame, appears most easily in the place where the wind has finally stopped trying to blow it out. Perhaps you have felt this trembling yourself, writing an email you have rewritten 12 times, the words growing stiffer the harder you try to make them perfect. Or perhaps it shows up at night, trying to force your mind into the right shape for sleep, gripping at calm the way the student gripped his brush, only to feel further from rest with every effort. Tonight, you do not need to hold anything steady. You do not need your thoughts to move in a perfect, practiced line. You can let your grip loosen, the way the calligrapher taught her student to loosen his hand, and trust that what wants to settle in you will settle on its own, without needing to be forced into shape. Let your breath be the brush moving without strain tonight, each inhale and exhale arriving on its own, asking nothing of you but to step out of its way and let it happen. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a passage in the Dojing that speaks of stillness overcoming restlessness, the way cold overcomes heat in winter, slowly, without struggle, simply by being more patient than the thing it overcomes. It does not say stillness defeats restlessness through force. It says stillness outlasts it, the way a quiet room eventually settles a noisy mind, simply by remaining quiet long enough. We often imagine that calm must be won through some decisive act, a single moment where we finally get a grip on our racing thoughts. But this teaching suggests something gentler, that calm is patient, and restlessness, given nothing to feed on, eventually exhausts itself and grows still on its own, the way the cold of winter never has to fight the heat of summer. It only has to wait for it to pass. There is something quietly reassuring in this. We are not asked to win some inner battle tonight. We are only asked to outlast the noise, the same patient way every winter has ever outlasted every summer before it. In a village known for its beekeepers, there was an old man whose hives were famous for never being disturbed, even when neighboring hives, kept by less patient men, swarmed and stung at the slightest provocation. People came from other villages to learn his methods. Certain he must know some trick involving smoke or sweetened water. He never charged anyone for the lesson, though most who came left disappointed, expecting some elaborate secret and receiving instead what sounded like nothing at all. It would take the young beekeeper in this story longer than most to understand why so many visitors left unsatisfied, despite having been told, quite plainly, exactly what they needed to know. A young beekeeper whose own hives had become agitated and dangerous after weeks of handling came to him one afternoon in despair. "My bees won't settle," he said. "Every time I approach the hive, they swarm. I've tried smoking them, I've tried moving slowly, I've tried everything I can think of, and they only grow more agitated." The old man walked with him back to his troubled hives, standing a respectful distance away, watching the bees circle in tight, anxious clusters near the entrance. "What do you do when they swarm like this?" the old man asked. "I back away, then come back a few minutes later to try again, hoping they've calmed down." "And have they?" "No. If anything, they seem worse each time I come back." The old man nodded slowly. "How many times a day do you approach them?" "I don't know. Many times. I check on them constantly, hoping to catch them in a calm moment so I can finally get the work done." "There is your answer," the old man said. "Every time you approach, even just to check, you disturb them again before they have finished settling from the last disturbance. You are not waiting for stillness, you are interrupting it before it can finish arriving." The young beekeeper frowned, watching the swarm above his hive. "But I have work to do. I can't just leave them alone forever." "I am not asking you to leave them alone forever," the old man said. "I'm asking you to leave them alone long enough. There is a difference between abandoning a task and giving it the patience it requires." "How long is long enough?" "Longer than you think and shorter than you fear. The trouble is that you keep checking before you've waited long enough to find out." The young man sat down a distance from the hive, frustrated. "I don't have your patience. I've never had it. Even as a boy, I wanted to know the outcome of things before they had finished happening." The old man sat beside him, his own posture loose and unhurried. "Patience is not a gift some people are born with and others are not. It's a muscle, like any other. You strengthen it the same way you'd strengthen an arm, slowly with practice, often while resenting the exercise. Then how do I practice it with these bees who won't even let me near them? You start by walking away today, not checking again until tomorrow morning. Let the swarm settle on its own time, without your interruption. That feels like doing nothing. It is the hardest kind of something there is," the old man said. "Doing nothing on purpose, with full attention, is far more difficult than doing something out of impatience. Most people cannot manage it. That is why most hives stay agitated longer than they need to." The young man returned home reluctantly, resisting the urge that evening to walk back and check on his bees, just once, just to see. He thought of little else all night, imagining the swarm still circling, picturing every possible disaster that his absence might allow. In the morning, he returned to the hive with his stomach tight with dread, certain he would find it in worse condition than he had left it. Instead, he found the bees moving calmly along the comb, going about their ordinary business, as though the agitation of the day before had simply burned itself out in the night, with nothing left to sustain it once he had stopped adding fuel. He went back to the old beekeeper that same morning, astonished. "They settled," he said, "just from being left alone." "Yes," the old man said, as though this were the least surprising thing he had heard all week. "Stillness does not need help to win. It only needs you to stop interfering with restlessness long enough for restlessness to run out of reasons to continue." But what if I hadn't waited? What if I'd gone back again last night, the way I wanted to? Then you would have given the swarm a new reason to stay agitated, and you would be sitting here this morning telling me your bees were worse than ever, wondering what trick you were missing. The trick was never a trick. It was only patience, applied for slightly longer than felt comfortable. I'm almost afraid to ask, but will this happen again? Will my hives get agitated like this in the future, even if I'm more patient? Almost certainly, the old man said without any apparent concern. Bees are bees. Weather changes, seasons turn. Something will startle them eventually, no matter how carefully you tend them. The point was never to prevent agitation forever. The point was to learn what to do once it arrives, which is far more useful than trying to keep it from ever showing up at all. So the goal isn't a hive that never swarms. The goal is a beekeeper who knows how to wait, the old man said, which is a far more durable skill than a hive that never has a difficult day. Hives will always have difficult days. Beekeepers who know how to wait will always find their way through them. The young beekeeper returned to his hives that day with a different relationship to them altogether, checking less, watching more, trusting that whatever agitation arose would, if simply left alone, find its own way back to calm, the same way it always had, long before he had ever started interrupting it. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding of restlessness settling on its own once it is no longer fed by attention. The Pali word for this kind of mental agitation is udhaka, written here as udducha, often translated as restlessness or worry, described as one of the hindrances to a clear and settled mind. Teachers in this tradition often advise simply observing restlessness without resisting it or chasing it away, much like watching weather pass across a sky that itself remains unchanged. There is a second point worth holding alongside this. In many Buddhist meditation traditions, the breath is used not to force calm, but to give the mind something steady to rest near while its own agitation naturally subsides, the way a swarm settles once nothing further disturbs it. The calm is not produced. It is simply allowed to surface once the disturbance has nothing left to feed on. Both the beekeeper's patience and the Buddhist practice of watching restlessness without resistance point toward the same understanding. We do not need to defeat our agitation through force. We need only stop interrupting its natural exhaustion and trust that it was never built to last forever without our help. You may recognize this pattern in your own nights, checking your phone one more time before sleep, hoping the next glance will finally settle your mind, only to find yourself more awake than before. Or perhaps it shows up as repeatedly returning to a worry, poking at it every few minutes, the way the young beekeeper kept approaching his hive, never giving it the space it needed to actually calm down. Tonight, you do not need to check on your thoughts again to see if they have settled yet. You do not need to test whether the restlessness has passed. You can simply stop interrupting it, the way the old man stopped interrupting his bees, and trust that what is agitated in you tonight is not endless. It is only waiting for you to stop adding fuel. Let your mind be like that hive in the early morning light, finally undisturbed, finally allowed to return to its own ordinary, quiet business, with nothing more required of you than this stillness, held a little longer than feels comfortable. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Taoism teaches that the sage does not argue, and for this reason, no one can argue with him. This is not about avoiding conflict out of weakness. It describes a kind of strength that does not need to prove itself, a clarity so settled it has nothing to defend. We often believe that understanding must be won through argument, through gathering enough reasons to finally convince ourselves or others that we are right. But there is another kind of knowing that needs no debate at all, the kind that simply rests undisturbed, the way a deep well holds its water, regardless of the wind above. The sage's silence is not emptiness. It is the quiet of someone who has nothing left to stir, because the stirring was never where the truth lived in the first place. Tonight, you do not need to win any argument with yourself before you are allowed to rest. You only need to let the arguing fall quiet, the same patient way a well falls quiet once the wind dies down. There was a well at the center of an old village, dug so deep that no one could remember a summer in which it had run dry. The villagers often spoke of how clear its water was, especially in the early mornings, before anyone had lowered a bucket to disturb it. The village elder had grown old beside that well, drawing water from it nearly every day of his life, and had come, over the decades, to think of it less as a source of water and more as a kind of teacher, quietly demonstrating the same lesson morning after morning to anyone patient enough to notice. A traveling merchant once arrived in the village in the middle of the night, exhausted from days of indecision about a trade dispute he could not resolve. Two parties had offered him conflicting deals, and he had argued the matter so many times in his own head that he could no longer tell which argument made more sense. He found the village elder sitting near the well, unable to sleep himself, watching the moonlight catch faintly on the water far below. "I need someone to help me think this through," the merchant said, and proceeded to explain the dispute in great detail. The figures, the promises made by each party, the risks of choosing wrong. The elder listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, but said nothing in response once the merchant finished. "Well?" the merchant asked. "What do you think I should do?" "Look into the well," the elder said. The merchant, confused but too tired to argue, leaned over the edge and peered down. The water was completely dark, with no moon visible at all. "I can't see anything," he said. "It's just black." "Wait," the elder said. They waited together in silence. After a while, a faint shimmer of moonlight appeared on the water's surface, faint at first, then steady. "There," the elder said. Now you can see the moon in the well. What does that have to do with my trade dispute? You asked me to argue your two choices through to a conclusion. I'm not going to do that. Arguing is what you have already been doing for days without success. If arguing could solve this, it would have solved it by now. Then what should I do instead? The same thing we just did. Wait long enough for the water to go still and let what's already there become visible, rather than trying to argue your way toward an answer that argument cannot reach. The merchant frowned, frustrated by what felt like an unsatisfying response after such a long explanation. But the well just had to wait for the water to calm. My situation has two parties pressuring me, deadlines, real consequences. I can't just wait. I'm not asking you to do nothing about your deadlines, the elder said. I'm asking you to stop arguing with yourself about which deal is correct, the way you've been doing in your head for days. That argument is not bringing you closer to clarity. It's only stirring the well harder. So how do I decide, if not by weighing the arguments? Sit with both choices the way you sat with this well, without forcing yourself toward either one. Let the question rest in you overnight, undisturbed by your usual debating. In the morning, notice what feels true, rather than what argues best. The merchant was skeptical. That sounds like I'm avoiding the decision, not making it. Many people confuse those two things, the elder said. Avoiding a decision means refusing to engage with it at all. What I'm describing is engaging with it differently, setting down the argument and letting the answer rise the way the moon rose in this well, without needing anyone to drag it up by force. The merchant sat by the well for a long while after the elder excused himself for the night, watching the moon's reflection grow steadier the longer the water remained undisturbed. He thought about the two deals, but this time, instead of running through the arguments again, he simply let himself notice how each one felt without immediately trying to justify the feeling. By the time he rose to return to his lodging, he found that one of the choices had begun to feel lighter in his chest than the other, though he could not have explained exactly why, no more than he could explain why moonlight chooses to settle on water only once the water has gone calm. In the morning, he sent word to the party he had felt drawn toward, still slightly uncertain whether he had made the wisest choice by every measure, but certain, at least, that the choice had not come from arguing himself into exhaustion. He returned to the well once more before leaving the village, this time finding the village elder there again, drawing water for the day. "I made my decision," the merchant said. "I assumed you would," the elder replied, lowering his bucket. "You don't want to know what I chose?" "Not particularly," the elder said, not unkindly. "What matters more to me is how you arrived at it. Did you argue your way there, or did you wait?" The merchant considered this. "I waited, mostly. I still thought about it, but I stopped fighting with myself over it." "Then it does not matter much to me which choice you made," the elder said. "A decision reached in stillness tends to serve you well enough, whichever direction it points. What if it turns out to be the wrong choice? Even a decision reached in stillness can turn out poorly," the elder admitted, drawing his bucket up from the depths and setting it on the stone ledge beside the well. "Stillness does not guarantee a perfect outcome. It guarantees only that you will not have exhausted yourself arguing before you ever began. That is no small thing, even if the choice itself proves imperfect. I suppose I expected stillness to promise more than that. Most people do when they first hear of it, the elder said, lifting the bucket to carry it back toward his home. But a calm mind facing a difficult outcome is still better off than an exhausted mind facing the same outcome. The water in the well is not promised to always show you exactly what you hope to see. It only promises to show you something true, which is worth more in the long run than anything comforting but false. The merchant walked with him partway back toward the village center, turning this over slowly, without the old urgency to argue it into a tidier shape. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding of stillness as the ground from which true understanding rises. The Hasidic masters often spoke of devotion through quiet attentiveness rather than constant intellectual struggle, teaching that the divine presence could be felt most clearly not through endless argument over scripture, but through a settled heart, much like the moon appearing only on quiet water. There is a second point worth holding here. Many Hasidic stories describe rebbes who, when approached by students wrestling with difficult questions, would respond not with a counter-argument, but with silence, a story or a simple gesture, trusting that the student's own understanding, given room, would surface more reliably than any argument could deliver it. The teaching was rarely handed over directly. It was allowed to be discovered, the way moonlight is discovered in water that has simply been left alone. Both the well and this tradition of quiet teaching point to the same understanding. Wisdom does not always arrive through contest. Sometimes it only needs us to stop disputing long enough for it to be seen. You may know the particular exhaustion of arguing with yourself at night, running through both sides of a decision again and again, hoping that one more pass of reasoning will finally settle it. Or perhaps it is a conversation you keep rehearsing, building your case in your head as though you might still need to win an argument that has already ended, or one that never needed winning at all. Tonight, you do not need to win the case you have been building against your own racing thoughts. You can let the arguing quiet, the way that well grew still once no one disturbed it, and let whatever is true simply rise into view on its own. Feel the moon settling now in the well of your own mind, faint at first, then steadier, needing nothing from you but the willingness to stop stirring the water around it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is an image in Taoist thought of a mirror that becomes clearer not through scrubbing, but through rest. A mirror left untouched, away from dust and handling, holds its reflective nature simply by being left alone. We often treat our own clarity the way an anxious person treats a mirror they fear has gone dull, rubbing at it constantly, polishing harder and harder, when the truth is the mirror was never the problem. The handling was. A mind, much like a mirror, has a natural capacity to reflect clearly. It loses this capacity not because the capacity disappears, but because it is constantly being touched, smudged, and rubbed at by our own anxious attention. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for our own clarity is simply to stop touching it. This is not neglect. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of trust. Trust that the mind, left alone, remembers how to reflect. In a mountain temple known for its polished bronze mirrors, there lived a monk responsible for their care. Pilgrims came from distant villages to see their reflections in mirrors so clear that some claimed they could see not only their faces, but something deeper, something about their own state of mind. The monk himself never made such claims. He simply tended the mirrors day after day with the same unhurried care he gave to every other task in the temple, never seeming to distinguish between the sacred and the ordinary in his daily work. A young novice was assigned to assist the monk, eager to learn the secret of achieving such clarity. He noticed that one particular mirror, kept in a private alcove, was dull and clouded, unlike the others. "Why is this one so cloudy?" he asked. "Shouldn't we polish it more than the others, since it needs it most?" The old monk shook his head. That mirror belonged to a previous keeper who polished it every single day, sometimes several times a day, convinced that more effort would make it clearer. And it didn't work? It made things worse. Bronze, when rubbed too often, even with care, develops a haze that no amount of additional rubbing can remove. He polished it into permanent cloudiness. The novice frowned at the dull mirror. "Then how do we fix it now?" "We don't, not by polishing. We simply stopped touching it 3 years ago. It has slowly been clearing on its own ever since, though it has a long way to go." A mirror can heal itself just by being left alone. In its own way, yes. The metal settles. The haze thins very slowly when nothing more disturbs its surface. It is much clearer now than it was 3 years ago, though you would not know that, having never seen how cloudy it once was. The novice considered this as he went about his daily tasks, polishing the temple's other mirrors with practiced, gentle strokes. A week later, he came to the old monk in some distress. "I think I have been doing to myself what that old keeper did to this mirror," he admitted. "I am constantly examining my own thoughts, polishing them, worrying over whether I am making progress in my practice. I check myself so often I think I might be making things worse instead of better." The old monk set down his cloth and looked at the novice with something like recognition. "Tell me what this checking looks like." "I ask myself constantly whether I am calm enough, focused enough, whether I have made progress since yesterday, since this morning, since an hour ago. I examine my own mind the way you might examine that mirror for the smallest spot of tarnish." "And has all this examining made you calmer?" The novice was quiet for a moment. "No, if anything, I feel more agitated than when I started practicing. I thought careful attention would bring clarity. Instead, it feels like I have rubbed myself into a haze, the way that keeper rubbed his mirror." "This is one of the oldest mistakes a sincere student makes," the old monk said, not unkindly. "We believe that examining our own clarity will produce more of it. But the examining itself is a kind of touching, a kind of disturbance. The mind, like bronze, needs rest from inspection as much as it needs anything else." "Then what should I do instead? Surely I can't simply abandon my practice." "No one is asking you to abandon anything. I'm asking you to stop checking on your own progress every hour, the way that old keeper checked his mirror every day. Sit Breathe. Let your attention rest somewhere simple, your breath, the sound of the wind outside, without immediately turning around to ask yourself how well you are doing it. That feels like giving up on improving. It is the opposite, the old monk said. The improving happens more easily once you stop interrupting it to check whether it's happening. A seed does not grow faster for being dug up every day to check its roots. If anything, the digging is what kills it. The novice took this teaching seriously, though he found it nearly as difficult as any physical practice he had undertaken. For weeks, every time he noticed himself reaching to evaluate his own calm, he gently set the evaluation aside, returning instead to simply being present with whatever he was doing, without commentary. Slowly, almost without his noticing the change directly, he found himself calmer in the evenings, less prone to lying awake replaying the day's small failures and successes. He mentioned this almost shyly to the old monk one morning while helping him prepare the mirrors for the day's visitors. "I think something has shifted," he said. "I'm not sure exactly when." "That is usually how it happens," the old monk said, lifting the once cloudy mirror from its alcove and holding it briefly to the morning light. It was noticeably clearer than it had been weeks before, though neither of them could point to the exact day the change had occurred. The clearing rarely announces itself. It only becomes visible once you finally stop checking for it every hour, and instead simply let it happen in its own quiet time. "Will this one ever be as clear as the others?" the novice asked, studying the faint remaining haze near its edge. "Perhaps not entirely," the old monk admitted. "Some haze, once set deeply enough into the bronze, may remain a part of it always, but that does not mean the mirror has failed, or that all this slow clearing has been wasted. A mirror with a little haze near its edge can still show a face clearly enough at its center. We do not need to wait for perfect clarity before something becomes useful again." That's strange comfort. I think I wanted to hear that it would become perfect eventually. "Most of us want that," the old monk said, setting the mirror gently back in its alcove. "But perfection was never the promise. The promise was only that what is left alone, undisturbed by anxious handling, tends to grow clearer than it was. Clearer is not the same as perfect, and clearer is usually enough." In Japanese Zen, there is a similar understanding expressed through the practice of shikantaza, written here as sheikantaza, often translated as just sitting, a form of meditation with no goal beyond simply being present, without striving toward enlightenment as though it were a destination to be chased down. Zen teachers often warn against what they call monkey mind, grasping for insight, comparing the effort to catch the moon's reflection in water by reaching for it with your hands. The more you grasp, the more the reflection scatters. There is a second point worth holding alongside this. The Zen tradition speaks of mushin, written here as mushin, meaning no mind, a state in which the practitioner acts and perceives without the interference of constant self-evaluation. A swordsman trained in this principle was said to move more precisely the less he thought about moving precisely, his attention settling into the action itself rather than circling back to judge it. Both the temple mirror and the practice of shikantaza describe the same gentle understanding. Clarity is rarely achieved by chasing it. It tends to arrive once we have finally stopped reaching for it and simply allowed ourselves to rest. You may recognize this in your own habit of checking how well you are doing at something, reviewing a conversation you just had, grading your own performance the way the novice graded his calm, only to find the grading itself the source of your unease. Or you may notice it at night, evaluating whether you are relaxed enough yet to sleep, which is itself a kind of polishing that only adds more haze. Tonight, you do not need to check whether you are calm enough. You do not need to evaluate your own breathing, your own thoughts, your own progress toward rest. You can let that evaluating hand rest at your side, the way the old monk eventually set down his polishing cloth, and trust that whatever clarity is meant to arrive will arrive without your supervision. Let your mind be like that bronze mirror left quietly in its alcove tonight, clearing in its own time, asking nothing of you but to stop checking on it long enough to let it happen. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Jing describes the great Tao as something that achieves everything by doing nothing in particular, a force that accomplishes without straining, the way a tree grows without ever deciding to grow. This effortless accomplishment is sometimes called Wu Wei, often translated as non-forcing or action without strain. It does not mean inactivity. It means moving in accordance with what is already happening, rather than pushing against the grain of the moment. When we apply enormous force to a problem that needed only patience, we are, in a sense, working against the Tao itself, fighting a current that would have carried us forward gently if we had simply let it. The clearest insights rarely arrive through force. They arrive through alignment, the way a sail catches wind it never had to create. The sailor does not summon the wind through effort. He simply turns the sail until it finds what was already moving past him. Near the edge of a cold northern forest, there was an archer renowned throughout the region for his accuracy, said to be able to split a single blade of grass at 30 paces. A young hunter, struggling badly with his own aim, sought him out after weeks of frustration and wasted arrows. The old archer rarely took students, having found over many years that most people wanted the skill far more than they wanted the patience required to develop it. But something in the young hunter's exhaustion, rather than his eagerness, persuaded him to make an exception this time. "I do everything you're supposed to do," the young hunter said, demonstrating his stance, his grip, his draw. "I focus completely on the target. I want to hit it more than anything, and still I miss, again and again." The old archer watched him loose an arrow, which sailed wide of the target by a considerable distance, burying itself in the frost-hardened ground. "Try again," the old archer said. The young hunter drew back, his arms visibly trembling with the effort of concentration, his eyes locked fiercely on the target, as though staring hard enough might pull the arrow toward it. The shot went even wider than before. "I don't understand," the young hunter said, lowering his bow in frustration. "The harder I try, the worse I shoot." "Yes," the old archer said, "that is often how it goes." "Then what am I supposed to do? Not try?" "Tell me what you are thinking about in the moment before you release the arrow." The young hunter considered this. the target, whether I'll hit it, whether I've drawn the bow correctly, whether my stance is right, whether I'm wasting another arrow. That is a great deal to think about in such a short moment, the old archer said. No wonder your hand shakes. But how else am I supposed to hit the target if I'm not thinking about hitting it? The old archer picked up his own bow and nocked an arrow, his motions unhurried, almost casual. "Watch my eyes," he said. "Where are they?" "On the target." "And where is my mind?" The young hunter watched closely as the old man drew the bow back in one smooth motion and released, the arrow finding the center of the target with no apparent effort at all. "I don't know. It looked like nowhere. Like you weren't thinking about anything." "That is closer to the truth than you might expect," the old archer said. "When I draw the bow, I am not thinking about whether I will hit the target. I am only doing what the bow and the arrow and my own hands already know how to do together, the way you do not think about each individual motion required to walk across a room. But you must have thought about it once when you were learning." "Of course. For years I thought about every part of it constantly, the same way you are thinking about it now. But the goal of all that thinking was never to keep thinking forever. It was to teach my body the motion so thoroughly that the thinking could finally step aside and let the motion happen on its own." The young hunter looked at his bow discouraged. "Then I have years ahead of me before I can shoot the way you do." "Perhaps fewer than you imagine," the old archer said. "The problem is not that you lack years of practice. The problem is that even in the moments where your body already knows what to do, you are interrupting it by wanting the outcome too badly in the instant of the shot. Wanting belongs before the shot and after the shot. It cannot live inside the shot itself." "How do I keep it out?" "You do not keep it out by force, which would only be another kind of straining. You let it go the way you'd let go of a held breath. Try again. This time, draw the bow, and instead of staring at the target as though you could will the arrow into it, simply notice the target the way you'd notice a tree on the side of a path you're walking, present but not gripped." The young hunter drew the bow again, trying to follow this strange instruction, though it felt nearly impossible to look at something without wanting it. His shot, to his own surprise, landed closer to the center than any of his previous attempts. "Better," the old archer said. "I still wanted to hit it," the young hunter admitted. "Of course you did. The wanting does not have to disappear completely. It only has to step back far enough that it is not gripping the bow alongside your hands." "How do I know if I've gotten the wanting to step back far enough? Is there a feeling I should be looking for?" The old archer considered this carefully before answering. "There is a feeling, though it is quieter than most feelings you are used to noticing. It is closer to relief than to triumph. You will know the wanting has stepped back because the moment of release will feel almost unremarkable, almost too simple to be the thing you were striving for so hard. That seems like an odd thing to aim for. Unremarkable. Most worthwhile things feel unremarkable from the inside," the old archer said. "It is only from the outside, watching the arrow land true, that anyone calls it remarkable at all. From where you are standing, holding the bow, it should feel like very little is happening. That is usually a good sign, not a bad one." They practiced together for the rest of the afternoon, the young hunter slowly learning to feel the difference between the quiet attention that aimed the bow and the anxious grasping that had been sabotaging his aim for weeks. He did not become a master archer that day, or even that season. But something in him began to understand, faintly, the strange truth the old man had been pointing toward, that the target is often missed, not from lack of desire, but from too much of it, crowding out the simple, settled motion that was capable of finding the mark on its own. In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding of action arising from a settled, attentive presence, rather than forceful striving. The old tales often describe warriors and poets entering what was called the imbas forus nai, written here as imbus forus nai, a state of illuminated insight achieved not through frantic effort, but through deliberate stillness, often induced by darkness, quiet, and the deliberate setting aside of ordinary striving. There is a second point worth holding here. Celtic tradition placed great importance on thresholds, the quiet, liminal spaces between one state and another, such as dusk, the shoreline, or the moment between waking and sleep. These in-between places were considered especially potent precisely because they could not be forced or hurried. Insight in these traditions was something one arrived at by entering the right kind of stillness, not something one manufactured through sheer determination. Both the archer's quiet aim and the Celtic threshold point to the same understanding. The clearest action, the clearest insight, tends to arrive not when we push hardest, but when we have settled enough to let it find us. You may recognize this pattern in your own striving, trying so hard to fall asleep that the trying itself becomes the obstacle. Your mind gripping at rest the way the young hunter gripped his bow, wanting it so badly that the wanting gets in the way. Or perhaps it shows up when you are trying to recall something, a name, a memory, and the harder you reach for it, the further it seems to slip away, only surfacing once you have stopped chasing it directly. Tonight, you do not need to aim for sleep the way an anxious archer aims for a target, gripping and straining and willing it into place. You can let your attention rest near sleep the way the old archer rested his attention near the target, present but not grasping. Let your breath find its own rhythm tonight, the way an arrow finds its own path once the hand has stopped fighting the bow, trusting that what you are reaching for arrives more easily once you stop reaching so hard. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in Taoist thought about the value of emptiness, that a bowl is useful because of the space inside it, that a room is useful because of the space between its walls. Emptiness is not nothing. It is the condition that allows something else to function. A mind crowded with constant thought is, in this sense, like a bowl filled to the brim with stones, unable to hold anything new, unable to receive. Clarity requires a kind of inner emptiness, a willingness to let some space remain unfilled, rather than packing every available moment with analysis. We tend to treat empty moments as wasted moments, something to be filled immediately with another thought, another plan, But it is precisely in that empty space that something clear has room to arrive. The bowl is not less valuable for being empty before dinner. It is, in fact, only useful because of that emptiness, waiting patiently to be filled in its own time. In a village near the coast, there lived a woman known for keeping the clearest jars of rice wine in the region, sought after by travellers who claimed her wine had a brightness that others lacked. A young winemaker came from a neighbouring village to learn her methods, having struggled for years to produce anything but cloudy, bitter batches. He had heard rumours that she guarded some special ingredient, some rare addition unavailable to lesser winemakers. He had travelled 3 days to learn what it was, only to discover, much to his initial frustration, that her ingredients were the same simple ones used by everyone else in the region. "I do everything the recipe says," he told her, showing her his latest attempt, a jar of wine still murky with sediment. "I measure carefully, I stir at the right times, I check on it constantly to make sure it's progressing well, and still it comes out cloudy." She held the jar up to the light, studying the swirling sediment within. "How often do you check on it?" "Every day, sometimes twice a day. I want to catch any problems early." "And when you check, what do you do?" "I open the lid, I look inside, sometimes I stir it gently to see how it's settling." She set the jar down. "There is your trouble. You are not letting it settle. You are interrupting the settling every single day, convinced that watching it closely will help it along." "But how will I know if something's wrong if I don't check?" "You will know because the smell will change or the color will turn in an obvious way. You do not need to check every day to catch a real problem, but you are checking so often that you never give the wine a chance to do what wine does best, which is nothing at all, for a long while, undisturbed." The young winemaker frowned, clearly uncomfortable with this advice. "It feels irresponsible to ignore it for so long." "It is not ignoring," she said. "It is trusting the process enough to let it happen without your constant supervision. There's a difference between neglect and patience, though I understand why the two can feel similar to someone who is anxious about the outcome." "I am anxious about the outcome. I've failed at this so many times." "I understand," she said, more gently now. "But consider this. Every time you failed, was it because you checked too little, or because you checked too much, disturbing the wine before it had finished clearing?" He thought back over his past attempts, each one ending in cloudy, disappointing wine. "I suppose I always checked it constantly. I thought that was just being careful." "Carefulness and interference are not the same thing," she said. "Sometimes the most careful thing you can do is leave something alone. Try this batch differently. Set it in the cellar, mark the date, and do not open it again for 3 full weeks. Not once." The young winemaker found this almost unbearable in practice. Several times over the following weeks, he found himself standing outside the cellar door, hand hovering near the latch, convinced that just one quick look would settle his nerves. Each time, he made himself walk away. On the 18th day, unable to bear it any longer, he went to the older woman in some distress. "I haven't opened it," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about it. What if it's gone bad? What if all this waiting has ruined it completely?" She smiled, the first time he had seen her smile since he'd arrived. You are doing to your own mind what you used to do to the wine, checking constantly, hoping that one more look will ease your worry, when the checking itself is what creates the worry in the first place. Then what should I do about my mind if not check on it? The same thing you are doing with the wine, though it is much harder. Leave it be. Trust that whatever is happening beneath the surface, in the jar or in your own thoughts, is happening whether or not you watch it. Your watching does not help it along. It only disturbs what would otherwise be settling on its own. He returned home and forced himself, with great difficulty, to wait out the remaining days without opening the cellar door even once. When the 3 weeks finally passed, he opened the jar with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation. The wine inside was clearer than anything he had ever produced, a pale golden clarity that caught the afternoon light without a trace of cloudiness. He brought a cup of it to the older woman, who tasted it slowly, nodding with what seemed like genuine satisfaction. "This is good wine," she said. "I can't believe it worked. I didn't do anything different except leave it alone." "You did the hardest thing there is," she said. "You created an empty space, days without interference, and let that emptiness do the work that all your careful checking never could. The wine did not need your attention to become clear. It needed the absence of your attention. That is a difficult lesson for anyone who cares deeply about getting something right. Will it be this hard every time, leaving things alone for so long?" "It tends to get easier," she said, refilling his cup, "not because the waiting itself becomes shorter, but because you stop fearing what the waiting might reveal or fail to reveal. The first jar is always the hardest to leave untouched. After that, you begin to trust the process more than you trust your own anxious checking. I think I understand why you never seemed worried all those years you've been making this wine." "I worried plenty when I was young," she admitted, smiling faintly at some memory he couldn't see. "I simply learned, slowly, that worrying at the jar never once made the wine clear any faster. It only ever made me more tired." He sat with this for a long while, turning the cup slowly in his hands, watching the wine catch the light without a single cloud disturbing its surface. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, there is a similar understanding of the value found in spaciousness, though it is usually applied to community rather than wine. Ubuntu is often summarized in the phrase, "I am because we are," emphasizing that a person's wholeness depends on the relationships and spaces held between people, not solely on individual striving. There is a recognition in this tradition that forcing connection, forcing resolution, often damages the very thing being sought, and that leaving room for silence, for listening, for unhurried presence allows understanding between people to settle naturally. There is a second point worth holding here. Ubuntu places great value on communal stillness during times of conflict, often gathering elders not to argue a dispute to its conclusion quickly, but to sit with it, to let emotions settle before resolution is even attempted. The space between speaking was considered as important as the speaking itself. Both the winemaker's jar and the Ubuntu circle describe the same understanding. What is empty is not absent. It is simply waiting, holding room for something to arrive that force alone could never produce. You may notice this same pattern in your own habits. checking your phone repeatedly after sending a difficult message, hoping each glance will ease your nerves, when in truth each glance only stirs the worry further. Or perhaps it shows up as replaying a conversation again and again in your mind before sleep, convinced that one more pass of analysis will finally bring peace, when peace was only ever going to arrive through leaving the conversation alone. Tonight, you do not need to check on your own thoughts to see how they are settling. You do not need to fill every quiet moment with another round of analysis. You can let some space remain empty tonight, unfilled, unchecked, undisturbed, and trust that whatever needs to clear will clear in that emptiness, the way wine clears in a jar no one keeps opening. Let this moment be like that sealed jar resting quietly in the dark, needing nothing from you now but your willingness to leave it alone. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a Taoist understanding that the eye sees better in darkness once it stops straining against it. At first, a dark room seems impossible to navigate, full of shapes we cannot name. But if we simply wait, without forcing our eyes to work harder, they adjust on their own, and shapes that were invisible begin to emerge from what had seemed like complete blackness. This is often how clarity works in the mind as well. We arrive at a confusing moment and immediately strain against the darkness, demanding that our eyes see further than they are ready to see. But the adjustment cannot be rushed by effort. It happens on a timeline of its own, one that only asks for patience, not strain. The clearest insights are often waiting in exactly this kind of darkness, ready to be seen the moment we stop straining and simply let our eyes adjust. Darkness, in this sense, is not the enemy of clarity. It is simply clarity's waiting room, asking only for patience before it opens its door. On a small island far from any mainland, there lived a navigator known across the surrounding waters for finding his way between islands without instruments, guided only by the stars, the swells, and a deep, quiet attentiveness that others struggled to learn. A young man, eager to follow in his footsteps, came to study under him, frustrated after months of failed attempts to read the sky the way his teacher did. The old navigator had trained many young men before him, and had noticed that the ones who struggled longest were almost always the ones who arrived already convinced that knowledge meant memorizing facts as quickly as possible, rather than letting understanding settle in its own unhurried way. "I stare at the stars every night," the young man said, "trying to memorize their positions, trying to calculate our heading, but by the time I've worked it all out, the boat has already drifted and I have to start over." The old navigator, sitting at the stern of a small canoe one clear night, motioned for the young man to lie back and simply look up. "Tell me what you see," he said. "Stars. Too many to count. I don't know where to start." "Don't start anywhere, just look." The young man tried, though his mind kept reaching for calculations, for names of constellations he had been taught, for the careful counting he believed was required. "I can't stop trying to figure it out," he admitted. "It feels like wasting time just to look without doing the math." How long have you been trying to do the math? Weeks, maybe longer. And in all that time, has the math gotten you where you needed to go? The young man was quiet for a moment. No, every time I've had to ask you to correct our course. The old navigator nodded slowly, the canoe rocking gently beneath them. There is a kind of knowing that comes from calculation, and there is a kind that comes from simply being present long enough that the pattern reveals itself without being forced. You have been trying to do the first when what is needed, at least for now, is the second. How do I do the second kind if I'm not supposed to calculate? You let your eyes rest on the sky without demanding anything from it. At first, it will seem like nothing. Too many stars, no order to them. But if you stay there without straining, the patterns begin to organize themselves, the way your eyes adjust to a dark room they could not see in moments before. The young man tried this, lying back and letting his eyes simply rest on the night sky without forcing himself to extract meaning from it immediately. For a long while it did feel like nothing, an overwhelming scatter of light with no order he could discern. "I still don't see anything useful," he said after a while, frustration creeping back into his voice. "You are trying again," the old navigator said gently. "I can hear it in your voice. Let the trying go. You are not failing by seeing nothing yet. You are simply still adjusting." The young man forced himself to relax his shoulders, to soften the urgency in his gaze, though it felt strange to look at something so important without gripping at it mentally. Slowly, almost without him noticing the shift, certain stars did seem to organize themselves in his awareness, not through calculation, but through a kind of quiet familiarity, the way a face becomes recognizable not through measuring its features, but through simply spending time with it. "I think I see the formation you taught me last week," he said hesitantly, pointing toward a cluster low on the horizon. "You do," the old navigator confirmed. "And did you calculate your way to seeing it, or did it simply appear once you stopped straining?" "It just appeared. I wasn't even trying when I noticed it." "That is usually how the sky reveals itself," the old man said, "not to those who interrogate it the hardest, but to those who have learned to rest their attention on it long enough for its order to surface on its own. The stars have always been in their positions. The only thing standing between you and seeing that order clearly was your own insistence on forcing the seeing to happen faster than it was ready to happen. Will I be able to do this on cloudy nights too, when there are no stars to rest my attention on at all?" "In time, yes," the old navigator said. "On those nights you rest your attention on the swell of the water instead, or the direction of the wind against your face. The principle does not change, only the thing you are resting your attention upon. The sky was simply the easiest place to begin learning it. It still seems like luck that I happened to notice the formation when I did." "Call it luck if you like," the old man said, not unkindly. "I called it luck myself the first several times it happened to me. It took me many years to understand that it was not luck at all, but readiness meeting patience, which from the outside can look exactly the same as luck, though it rarely is." They continued out on the water for the rest of the night, the young man practicing this quieter kind of attention, occasionally losing it and reaching back into strained calculation, occasionally finding it again, the way one finds and loses balance while learning something difficult. By the time the sky began to lighten toward dawn, he had not mastered the navigator's skill. Not nearly. but he understood for the first time the difference between forcing an answer out of the dark and waiting long enough for the dark to reveal it on its own. In Polynesian wayfinding traditions, there is a similar understanding of knowledge arising from sustained, quiet attention rather than constant active calculation. Traditional navigators, sometimes called pa.lu in certain island dialects, were trained for years not merely in memorizing star paths, but in cultivating a felt sense of the ocean's swells, the wind, and the sky, allowing this felt knowledge to guide them even on cloudy nights when no stars were visible at all. There is a second point worth holding alongside this. These navigators often spoke of a state of heightened, relaxed awareness during long voyages, in which the boat itself seemed to communicate its position through subtle motion, something that could only be sensed once the mind had stopped gripping for explicit answers and instead allowed perception to widen on its own terms. Both the young man's slow recognition of the stars and the wayfinder's felt sense of the sea point to the same understanding. Some knowledge cannot be extracted by force. It can only be received patiently by a mind that has stopped straining long enough to notice what was there all along. You may know this feeling from trying to recall a forgotten word, the name of a song, a memory just out of reach, where the harder you grasp for it, the further it seems to retreat, only to surface later, unbidden, the moment you stop trying. Or perhaps it appears at night, trying to force a sense of calm the way the young man tried to force a reading of the stars. Gripping at relaxation slips further away. Tonight, you do not need to calculate your way toward rest. You do not need to force your mind into recognizing a pattern before it is ready to be seen. You can let your attention rest softly, the way the navigator rested his gaze on the open sky, trusting that whatever needs to become clear will organize itself in its own quiet time. Let your eyes, even closed, begin to adjust now to this gentle darkness, the way they would adjust to any unfamiliar room, finding their way without strain, simply by being given enough time. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching that runs through Taoist thought about the uncarved block, a piece of wood before it has been shaped into any particular tool. In its uncarved state, it holds every possibility. The moment it is carved into something specific, it gains a use, but loses the openness it once had. A mind constantly forcing itself toward a single conclusion is, in a way, carving itself prematurely, cutting away possibilities before it has even finished sensing what shape might actually fit. Stillness allows the block to remain whole a little longer, giving the right shape time to reveal itself, rather than being hacked out in haste. Sometimes the wisest choice is not to carve faster, but to hold the block a while longer, trusting that the right form is already waiting inside it, patient, unhurried, in no rush to be forced into being. The block does not lose anything by waiting a little longer. If anything, it gains the chance to become exactly what it was always meant to be, rather than whatever shape haste demanded of it first. In a dry, red earth country far from any coastline, there was an elder known for walking long distances alone, tracing paths that had been walked by his ancestors for longer than anyone could measure. He never seemed lost, even in country unfamiliar to those travelling with him, moving instead with a quiet certainty that puzzled the younger members of his community. Some of the younger people assumed he had simply memorized every path by heart over his long lifetime. He never corrected this assumption directly, though those who walked with him long enough eventually noticed that his certainty had little to do with memory at all. A young man troubled by a decision he could not resolve, no matter how much he turned it over, found the elder resting beneath a lone tree during a long walk between two distant places. "I have a problem I cannot solve," the young man said, sitting beside him. "I have a choice to make about who to marry, and I have weighed it from every direction. I cannot find an answer, no matter how hard I think about it." The elder said nothing for a while, watching the heat shimmer faintly over the distant red earth. "Do you know how I find my way across this country?" the elder finally asked. "By the paths your people have always walked." "The song lines?" "Yes. But do you know how I follow them when the land looks unfamiliar, when there is no obvious path carved into the dirt?" The young man shook his head. "I do not force myself to remember the way," the elder said. "I let the land remind me. I walk slowly enough that the song that belongs to this stretch of country can rise up in me on its own, rather than trying to drag it up by force." "What does that have to do with my decision?" "You are trying to force your way to an answer the way someone might try to force their way across unfamiliar country without listening to it. Pushing ahead too fast, ignoring the signs that might guide you, demanding the path reveal itself before you have even slowed down enough to notice it." The young man frowned. "But this is about who I should marry. It's not the same as walking somewhere." "Is it not? You are trying to find your way to a place you have not yet been, a future, a choice, a life with one woman instead of another. The songlines do not exist only on this land. They exist in every decision a person has to feel their way through if they know how to listen for them." "How do I listen for a songline in my own choice, then?" "Stop trying to think your way there so quickly. Slow down. Spend time with each woman, not as a problem to solve, but as a person to simply be near. The way I am simply near this land rather than constantly demanding it explain itself to me. I've spent time with both of them. That's part of what's confusing me." "Have you spent that time trying to feel what is true, or trying to calculate which is the better choice? There is a difference, the same difference between walking this country to listen to it and walking it only to measure the distance as quickly as possible." The young man considered this for a long while, watching the same shimmer of heat over the same red earth the elder had been watching. "I think I have been calculating, comparing, building arguments in my head for one, then the other. That is the noise that drowns out the song," the elder said. "It is not wrong to think, but thinking that argues, that calculates, that pushes toward an answer before the answer is ready, makes it harder to hear what is actually true. The country does not reveal its paths to someone arguing loudly with himself as he walks. It reveals them to someone quiet enough to notice what was already there. What if I slow down and there's still nothing there? What if I listen and hear no song at all? The elder allowed a small, weathered smile. In all my years walking this country, I have never come to a stretch of land with no song belonging to it, even when I could not hear it myself for a long while. Some songs take longer to surface than others. That does not mean they are absent. It only means I have not yet slowed down enough to hear them. The young man returned home from his long walk without an answer, but with something quieter inside him than the constant arguing that had occupied his mind for weeks. He stopped trying to calculate his way to a decision, and instead simply spent unhurried time near each woman, paying attention not to arguments, but to the quiet, steady feeling that rose in him when he was near each one, without immediately interrogating that feeling for proof. Weeks later, walking the same stretch of country again, he encountered the elder once more, resting beneath the same tree. "Did you find your answer?" the elder asked. "I think so," the young man said. "It came quietly. I almost didn't notice it arriving because I had stopped expecting it to come from arguing." "That is usually how the song reveals itself," the elder said, closing his eyes against the bright afternoon light. "Not through demand, but through the kind of attention that is patient enough to let the land, or the heart, finally speak." "I almost wish it had come with more certainty," the young man admitted. "It feels quiet, but quiet isn't the same as sure." "No," the elder agreed, "it is not the same. But ask yourself honestly, has certainty ever once been what you were chasing in all those weeks of arguing? Or were you only chasing relief from the noise and calling that certainty because it was the only name you had for what you wanted?" The young man considered this for a long moment, the heat still shimmering faintly over the red earth between them. "I think I was chasing relief," he admitted. "I just didn't know there was a difference." "There is a considerable difference," the elder said. "Certainty rarely comes to anyone in matters of the heart, but relief, the kind that comes from no longer arguing with yourself, that is available to nearly everyone the moment they stop demanding the other thing instead." In Aboriginal Australian tradition, there is a similar understanding embedded in the practice of songlines, paths across the land that are known not through maps, but through story, song, and a felt sense passed down across generations. These paths could not be forced into memory through rote calculation. They had to be walked, sung, and felt repeatedly until they became part of a person's own quiet knowing. There is a second point worth holding here. Many Aboriginal teachings emphasize a deep, unhurried relationship with country, where understanding arises through long, attentive presence rather than urgent inquiry. The land was understood to reveal itself on its own timeline, often only to those patient enough to listen rather than demand. Both the young man's quiet search and the wisdom of songlines describe the same understanding. Some answers cannot be reached by pushing harder toward them. They can only be walked towards slowly, listened for patiently, until they rise, almost unnoticed, into a clarity that was there all along. You may recognize this pattern in a decision of your own, weighing two choices so many times that the weighing itself becomes exhausting. certain that one more comparison will finally settle things, when what is actually needed is simply more unhurried time spent feeling rather than calculating. Or perhaps it shows up as trying to force an emotional clarity that refuses to arrive on command, no matter how directly you demand it of yourself. Tonight, you do not need to argue your way toward any decision. You do not need to calculate the songline of your own life by force. You can let your attention rest quietly, the way the elder rested near the unfamiliar land, trusting that whatever path belongs to you will rise into awareness in its own time. Let this stillness tonight be like the quiet country waiting to reveal its own song, needing nothing from you but the patience to listen rather than demand. Let us pause here for a moment, take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is an old Taoist image of a wheel turning around a still center. The spokes move, the rim moves, but the hub itself remains motionless. And it is this stillness at the center that allows the whole wheel to function. A cart with a moving hub would shake itself apart. We are often like wheels trying to move from the rim instead of the center, throwing ourselves into motion and effort without ever resting in the quiet hub that could actually steady us. Clarity in this sense is not found by joining the spinning. It is found by returning to the still point the spinning depends on. The mind, like the wheel, cannot find its balance by speeding up. It finds balance only by remembering the calm, unmoving center it was built around all along. That center was never lost. It was only forgotten for a while, the way a wheel in motion can forget, briefly, that its own hub is what makes the turning possible at all. In a settlement built near a great limestone cave, there lived a keeper of the calendar, responsible for tracking the long, patient cycles of sun, moon, and season that the community depended on for planting and harvest. He was known for his stillness, sitting for hours in quiet observation while others around him hurried about their daily tasks. He had inherited the role from his own teacher decades before, and had spent most of his life learning that the calendar's accuracy depended less on cleverness than on a willingness to sit quietly with the sky for far longer than most people had patience for. A young record keeper, recently given responsibility for tracking a difficult set of calculations involving the timing of a coming festival, came to him in some distress. "I have tried for days to work out the correct date," the young man said. "Every time I think I have it settled, I find another consideration I forgot to include, and I have to start the whole calculation over. I am exhausted, and the festival grows closer." The old keeper invited him to sit at the cave's entrance, where a single shaft of light fell each day at roughly the same hour, marking the passage of the season against a series of carved lines on the stone floor. "Watch the light," the old keeper said. The young man watched, though he found it difficult to sit still, his mind still circling through unfinished calculations. "It hasn't moved," he said after a while, restless. "It has moved, just slowly. You are used to watching things that move quickly. Water poured from a jug, a bird in flight. This light moves at the pace of the turning earth itself, which feels like stillness to a mind that has not yet slowed down to match it. How does this help my calculation? Tell me about your calculation, the old keeper said. The young man explained it in detail, the layered considerations, the corrections upon corrections, the way each new fact seemed to unsettle everything he had worked out before. The old keeper listened patiently, then asked, "When you sit down to calculate, where does your mind go first?" "Straight to the numbers. I want to get it right as quickly as possible." "And has going straight to the numbers as quickly as possible given you a stable answer yet?" The young man sighed. "No, every answer falls apart within a day. This is because you are calculating from the rim of the wheel instead of the hub," the old keeper said. "The rim moves quickly, spinning with every new fact, every new worry. But the hub does not move at all. It is the still center the whole wheel depends on. If you calculate from the rim, you will always be dizzy, always finding new corrections, because the rim never stops turning. What is the hub in my case? I don't understand what that would even mean for a calculation. The hub is the patience to sit with the question before rushing to answer it. Before you touch a single number tomorrow, sit here at this cave entrance and watch the light fall across the stone for a while, without thinking about your calculation at all. Let your mind settle into something slower than the spinning you've been doing. That feels like a waste of the little time I have left before the festival." "Perhaps," the old keeper said, "or perhaps it is the only way you will actually finish your calculation correctly, rather than circling it endlessly from the rim." Reluctantly, the young man returned the next morning and sat at the cave's entrance as instructed, watching the light creep slowly across the carved lines on the floor. It felt unbearably slow at first, his mind itching to return to his numbers, to start working the problem the way he always had. But as the light continued its unhurried crawl, something in him began to slow as well, matching its pace almost without meaning to. By the time the shaft of light reached the carved line marking midday, his mind had grown quieter than it had been in days. He returned to his calculations that afternoon and found to his surprise that the layered corrections he had been wrestling with for days suddenly arranged themselves with far less effort, as though the answer had been waiting calmly the whole time, simply for his mind to grow still enough to notice it clearly. He brought his completed calculation to the old keeper the next morning, relieved and slightly bewildered. "It came together so quickly once I sat with you yesterday," he said. "I don't understand why." "You stopped calculating from the rim," the old keeper said, glancing briefly at the light now falling in its familiar place near the cave's entrance. "You found the hub instead, even if only for an afternoon. The wheel always turns more smoothly once a person remembers where its true center is." "Will I need to sit here every time I have a difficult calculation? I worry I won't always have a cave entrance and a patient teacher nearby." The old keeper smiled faintly. The cave entrance was never the important part. It was simply a place quiet enough to help you remember the stillness already inside you. In time, you will not need this particular light or this particular stone floor. You will be able to find the hub anywhere, even in the middle of a noisy market, once you've practiced finding it here enough times to trust that it's real. That's a comforting thought, though I admit I don't quite believe it yet. "You don't need to believe it yet," the old keeper said, watching the light continue its unhurried crawl across the warm stone. Belief tends to follow practice rather than the other way around. Come back tomorrow and the day after, whenever your calculations spin too fast. Eventually, you'll notice you no longer need to come back at all. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding of stillness as the necessary center around which great cycles turn. The long count calendar tracked vast cycles of time, but at the heart of Mayan cosmological thought was the recognition that these enormous cycles depended on a still, sacred center, often represented by the world tree, rooted motionless, while the heavens wheeled visibly around it. There is a second point worth holding alongside this. Mayan astronomer priests engaged in long periods of careful, patient observation before making important calendrical decisions, understanding that rushing such calculations risked misalignment with cycles too vast to be hurried by human impatience. Their accuracy came not from speed, but from a willingness to watch slowly, repeatedly, across long stretches of unhurried time. Both the Calendar Keeper's Cave and the Mayan World Tree describe the same understanding. Great cycles of change depend on something motionless at their center. And clarity, like those cycles, becomes available only once we remember to return to that still point rather than chasing answers from the spinning rib. You may recognize this in your own habit of calculating from the rim, running through a problem at top speed, certain that quick thinking will produce a stable answer, only to find the answer dissolving again within a day, requiring you to start over. Or perhaps it shows up at night, trying to plan tomorrow down to the smallest detail, spinning through scenarios faster and faster, when what you actually need is to find the still hub at the center of your own racing mind. Tonight, you do not need to keep calculating from the rim. You do not need to spin faster to find your answer sooner. You can let your attention settle toward the still center you carry within you, the same hub that has been there all along, beneath every spinning thought. Let your breath find that hub now, slow and steady, while the rest of your mind, like the rim of a great wheel, gradually slows around it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a final image worth holding from Taoist thought, that the soft and yielding eventually overcomes the hard and rigid, the way water, given enough patience, wears down even the hardest stone. This is not a teaching about weakness. It is a teaching about a different kind of strength, one that does not need to clash against difficulty to resolve it. A mind that insists on forcing its own clarity is, in a sense, behaving like stone, rigid, resistant, certain that hardness is the same as strength. But the Tao suggests something gentler, holds more lasting power. Snow falling through still air settles exactly where it needs to settle, without struggle, without resistance, simply by yielding to its own quiet weight. The most lasting clarity tends to arrive this way too, not through hardness, but through a soft, patient yielding that in the end outlasts every harder thing it meets. Tonight, as we close this journey together, That softness is enough. It always was. In a cold, mountainous region known for harsh winters, there lived a woodcarver who made small glass orbs filled with water, each one containing a tiny carved scene and a scattering of fine white flakes that, when shaken, swirled like a private snowstorm before slowly settling back to the bottom. He had made hundreds of these orbs over the years, selling most of them to travelers passing through on their way to somewhere else. He rarely explained their meaning to anyone who did not ask directly, content to let the object speak for itself, the same patient way he let everything else in his workshop speak for itself. A merchant's son, anxious and restless after months of trying to decide whether to take over his father's business or pursue a different path entirely, came to the woodcarver's workshop seeking a gift for his ailing grandmother, though he found himself unable to stop talking about his own troubles the entire visit. "I've thought about this decision every single day for months," he said, turning one of the orbs over in his hands without really looking at it. "Some days I'm certain I should take the business. Other days I'm just as certain I should leave. I can't get a clear answer no matter how much I think about it." The old woodcarver took the orb gently from his hands and shook it firmly, sending the tiny white flakes inside swirling into a dense, obscuring cloud. "What do you see inside it now?" he asked. "Nothing. Just snow everywhere. I can't see the scene at all." "Watch," the woodcarver said, setting it down on the table between them. They sat together in silence as the flakes inside slowly drifted downward, the cloud thinning gradually until the small carved scene at the bottom, a tiny house beneath a tiny mountain, became visible once more, clear and undisturbed. "It cleared," the merchant's son said, somewhat impatiently. "But what does that have to do with my decision?" "Every time you turn your decision over again in your mind," the old woodcarver said, "you are shaking this orb. The scene at the bottom does not disappear when you shake it. It is only obscured for a while by your own disturbance. So I should just stop thinking about it completely?" "I did not say that," the woodcarver replied patiently. "I said, stop shaking it. There's a difference between holding a question and shaking it apart. You can hold this decision the way you'd hold the orb after it has settled, gently, with attention, without needing to disturb it again just to see if the scene is still there." The merchant's son frowned, clearly frustrated by an answer that felt too simple for a problem that had occupied him for so many months. "But what if I leave it alone and the answer still doesn't come? What if it just stays empty, like there's nothing actually at the bottom?" The old woodcarver gestured to the orb, now fully settled, the tiny scene crisp and visible in the afternoon light. "Was there nothing at the bottom a moment ago, when it was clouded with snow?" "No. The house and the mountain were there the whole time. I just couldn't see them." "Exactly," the woodcarver said. "Your answer is the same. It is not absent simply because your mind has been too disturbed to see it clearly. It is waiting at the bottom of all that swirling, the same as this little house has been waiting at the bottom of all that snow." "Then how do I know when it's settled enough to see clearly? I've been confused for so long, I'm not sure I'd recognize clarity if it showed up." The woodcarver picked up a second orb from his workbench, shaking it gently this time, just enough to stir the flakes without sending them into total chaos. Watch this one instead. A lighter shake creates a lighter disturbance and it settles faster. Your decision may not need months of frantic shaking to find its answer. It may simply need you to stop adding force each time you feel uncertain and let the smaller disturbances settle as they come, rather than constantly stirring up a storm. The merchant's son watched the second orb clear far more quickly than the first had, the tiny scene emerging steadily, calmly, without the long wait the first orb had required. "I think I've been making this harder than it needed to be," he admitted. "Most of us do," the woodcarver said. "We mistake the shaking for thinking, and we mistake the thinking for progress. But progress in matters like this often looks like very little at all from the outside. It looks like sitting quietly while something that was already settled simply becomes visible again. What if I forget all this the moment I leave your workshop and start shaking everything again out of habit?" The old woodcarver chuckled softly, wrapping the two orbs carefully in cloth for the journey home. "You probably will forget now and then. Habits built over months do not vanish in a single afternoon, however clear that afternoon felt. But you will have these two small orbs to remind you, sitting quietly on a shelf, doing nothing at all except holding their own settled stillness, waiting for you to notice it again whenever you need to. That seems like a small thing to carry such a large lesson." "The smallest things often carry the largest lessons," the woodcarver said, handing him the wrapped bundle. "That has been true of every orb I've ever made, and I suspect it will be true of whatever decision you eventually settle into as well." The young man left the workshop that evening with a small orb for his grandmother and another for himself, setting it carefully on the table beside his bed. In the weeks that followed, whenever his mind began turning frantically over the same old arguments, he found himself glancing at the orb, remembering not to shake it any harder than it already had been shaken, and letting the scene at the bottom return again and again to its own quiet clarity. He did not say, even months later, exactly which choice he eventually made. But those who knew him noticed that he made it calmly, without the frantic urgency that had marked every one of his earlier attempts to force an answer into being. In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding found in the image of Yggdrasil, written here as Yggdrasil, the great tree whose roots reach down into a deep, still well of memory and fate. A source of wisdom accessible only through quiet sacrifice and patient attention rather than forceful pursuit. The god Odin was said to have hung from this tree in stillness for 9 long nights before gaining true understanding. An act not of struggle, but of surrendered waiting. There is a second point worth holding here. Norse tradition also speaks of the Norns, beings who tend the well at the roots of the great tree, drawing water to nourish it slowly, patiently, day after day, never rushing the tree's growth, trusting instead in the long, unhurried rhythm of its unfolding. Wisdom in this tradition was something tended carefully over time, not seized in a single forceful act. Both the snow globe's settling scene and Odin's 9 nights of stillness point toward the same understanding. The deepest clarity rarely arrives through force or struggle. It arrives through a patient, surrendered waiting that trusts the answer was already present long before the seeking began. You may recognize this pattern in your own racing thoughts before sleep. shaking the same worry over and over, hoping each new round of thinking will finally reveal a clear answer, when really each new round only stirs the flakes back into a fresh, obscuring cloud. Or perhaps it shows up in a decision you've been carrying for a long while, returning to it nightly, certain that one more forceful shake will finally settle the matter for good. Tonight, you do not need to shake anything further. You do not need to stir your thoughts into one more storm before you are allowed to rest. You can let your mind be like that orb after the shaking has stopped. The tiny scene at its center slowly, quietly becoming visible again, asking nothing more of you than your stillness. Even if the urge to shake it once more rises in you, you do not have to act on it. You can simply notice the urge, the way you might notice a familiar habit, and let it pass without obeying it, the same way the merchant's son eventually learned to set the orb down rather than pick it back up. Let this whole evening be the settling itself, the snow falling gently downward inside you, with nothing left to do now but rest and let it finish. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the Taoist teaching that a disturbed mind, like muddied water, only needs stillness to become clear again. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We sat beside a muddy pond and watched a young man learn that stirring cannot reveal what only stillness can show. We sat at a potter's wheel and felt the difference between guiding and forcing a shape into being. We fished beside a slow river and discovered that a riverbed, like the self, is uncovered rather than invented. We watched a calligrapher's trembling hand grow steady the moment her student stopped wanting the stroke too badly. We sat with restless bees and learned that agitation left undisturbed eventually runs out of reasons to continue. We looked into a deep village well and found that some questions are answered by patience rather than argument. We tended a clouded bronze mirror and learned that clarity is restored by rest, not by rubbing harder. We drew a bow beside a quiet archer and felt a target missed, not from too little wanting, but from too much. We sealed a jar of cloudy wine and discovered that some of the most important work happens in the absence of our attention. We lay beneath a wide night sky and let our eyes adjust to darkness rather than straining against it. We walked dry, red earth country and listened for a songline that could not be forced into hearing. We sat at the mouth of a limestone cave and found the still, motionless hub at the center of a turning wheel. And we held a small glass orb and watched snow settle quietly to the bottom, revealing a tiny house that had been there all along. We are not vessels that need to be filled with more thinking. We are wells that only need to be left undisturbed. We are not minds that must work harder to become clear. We are water that only needs permission to stop being stirred. We are not failures for not yet having an answer. We are simply still in the part of the process where the mud has not yet settled. We are not behind. We are not broken. We are not late to some deadline that clarity has quietly set for us. We are not required to arrive anywhere tonight except into rest. We are exactly where stillness always finds us, waiting, patient, already capable of the clarity we have been chasing so hard to produce. This is the central thought we have circled all night, from 13 different directions, in 13 different voices, borrowed from traditions far older than any of us. A disturbed mind does not need to be forced into clarity. It needs only to be left alone long enough for its own nature to return. The answer you have been reaching for is rarely absent. It is only obscured, the way a riverbed is obscured by a current that has not yet learned to slow down. We often believe we must think our way out of confusion, stirring the water harder when what it actually needs is to be left alone. Stillness is not the absence of an answer. It is the condition that allows an answer already present to become visible. Tonight was an invitation to stop stirring and let whatever is unclear simply settle on its own time, in its own quiet way. This is not a teaching you master once and carry forward forever, finished, settled, never needing it again. It is a teaching you return to, again and again, every time your own mind grows cloudy with effort, every time you find yourself stirring a question, instead of simply letting it rest. That returning is not a failure either. It is, in its own way, the whole practice, noticing the stirring and choosing gently to stop. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Perhaps it was the pond, or the wheel, or the small house at the bottom of the snow globe. Perhaps it was nothing you can name at all, only a quiet loosening somewhere behind your eyes, somewhere beneath your breastbone, a sense that you do not have to work so hard to feel at peace. Whatever it was, however small, it is enough to carry you the rest of the way into sleep. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.